Imagine waking up one morning in America with money in the bank, stocks soaring, and the future looking brighter than ever, only to go to bed that night with everything gone. No war, no invasion, no warning, just a sudden collapse that erased billions in wealth and pushed an entire nation into hunger, despair, and dust. How did the United States throw the wildest party of the century and then stumble into the darkest economic disaster in its history? To find out, we need to rewind to the roaring 1920s. The decade when optimism, jazz, and reckless risk-taking built a tower so tall no one believed it could ever fall. The wild boom of the 1920s. The First World War was over, soldiers were home, and America was buzzing with new energy. Factories that once churned out weapons now pumped out toasters, refrigerators, and shiny new cars. Henry Ford's moving assembly line cut production time from 12 hours to just 90 minutes, flooding the streets with Model Ts and igniting demand for oil, steel, and rubber. Cities lit up with electricity, while radios turned living rooms into concert halls. 10 million homes tuned in by 1929, filling the air with jazz, news, and commercials. But while cities celebrated, farmers were falling behind. Wartime demand had vanished, crop prices crashed, and desperate families borrowed money for tractors that only pushed them deeper into debt. Meanwhile, city dwellers discovered a dangerous new thrill. Buy now, pay later. Radios, cars, even stocks could be bought on installment plans, as banks handed out credit to anyone with a pulse. And at the heart of this frenzy was Wall Street. The stock market became the ultimate playground. Margin loans let everyday people buy $100 worth of stock with just $10 down. Barbers, shoeshine boys, even hotel bellhops were handing out stock tips like candy, convinced that the good times could never end. The Dow Jones skyrocketed, quadrupling in just 5 years. Companies created layer upon layer of holding companies built on nothing but hype, while critics who warned of danger were drowned out by jazz bands and champagne. It was optimism on steroids, and no one wanted the music to stop. Black Tuesday, the day America fell. October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday, the day the American dream face-planted. Inside the New York Stock Exchange, the air turned electric, but not with optimism, with panic. The ticker tape spewed endless red numbers, phones rang off the hook, and men in suits shouted until their voices cracked. In just hours, $14 billion evaporated. Adjusted for today, that's more than $200 billion. Homes, college funds, life savings, wiped out as if they never existed. Margin loans that once felt like free money now became death traps. Investors who had put down $10 for $100 in stocks suddenly owed the other $90 immediately. Portfolios collapsed like sandcastles in the tide. Millionaires on Monday were bankrupt by Thursday. Bankers who once bragged over martinis now sat frozen at their desks, staring at numbers that made no sense. But it didn't stop with Wall Street. The banks themselves began to crumble. Ordinary people rushed to their local branches, banging on locked doors, demanding the savings that no longer existed. Families lost everything overnight. A grandfather's bonds, worthless. A mother's savings, gone. Little Timmy's piggy bank, still full, making him, in some tragic twist, the richest in the family. And this disaster wasn't just American. When U.S. banks panicked and called in foreign loans, Europe cracked too. Germany's fragile recovery collapsed, Britain staggered, and global trade was cut in half within just 3 years. Yet even as the world unraveled, newspapers printed cheerful lies. Market adjusts as investors take profits, right next to photos of families pawning wedding rings to buy bread. The roaring 20s hadn't just ended. They had slammed into a brick wall, carrying an entire generation's hopes with them. But the crash was only the beginning. What followed was darker, harder, and far more personal. A nation on its knees. By 1931, the party was over and the silence was deafening. Factories that once roared with life stood still. In Detroit, the auto plants shut their doors one by one, production dropping by nearly 75%. Men who had built the American dream now stood outside locked gates, waiting for jobs that would never return. Unemployment soared to 25%. 1 in every 4 Americans out of work. In the cities, endless breadlines stretched through downtown streets. Mothers stood in the cold for hours, just to bring home a bowl of thin soup. Children fainted in classrooms, not from boredom, but from hunger. Teachers stopped asking for homework and started asking if their students had eaten at all. This wasn't metaphorical starvation. America was literally starving. And then came the Dust Bowl. Years of overfarming left the land brittle, and when the rains stopped, the soil simply blew away. Towering dust Dust storms swept across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, swallowing farms, livestock, and homes. Families woke up covered in earth that used to feed them. Millions packed everything they owned into broken-down cars and drove west, chasing whispers of jobs in California. For many, those promises ended in disappointment and more poverty. President Hoover tried to reassure the nation, urging volunteerism and small relief programs. He pointed proudly to the Hoover Dam, a marvel of engineering, but dams couldn't feed a starving child. His refusal to offer sweeping aid turned his name into a curse. Hoovervilles for the shanty towns, Hoover blankets for newspapers used as cover, Hoover flags for empty pockets, turned inside out. By 1932, desperation boiled over. World War I veterans marched to Washington, demanding the bonuses they had been promised. Instead of help, they were met with tear gas and fire. The government had turned its weapons on its own heroes, and Americans were horrified. Trust in leadership shattered. As hope faded, radical movements spread. Socialists and communists gained followers, not out of ideology, but out of hunger. Crime surged. Bank robbers like Bonnie and Clyde or John Dillinger were celebrated as folk heroes, rebels striking back at the same institutions that had failed ordinary people. America wasn't just broke, it was broken. And yet somehow, people endured. They migrated. They held their families close. They survived. Not because they believed in a brighter tomorrow, but because they had no other choice. Hope in the rubble, FDR, and the New Deal. By March 1933, America was on its knees. Banks were failing. Families were desperate, and trust in government was at rock bottom. Then Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped up to the podium on Inauguration Day. His words cut through the fear like a blade. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. For the first time in years, Americans took a collective breath, but Roosevelt didn't stop at words. He delivered action. Within weeks, young men in worn-out clothes were handed shovels through the Civilian Conservation Corps. They planted trees, built trails, and restored hope in themselves as much as the land. The Works Progress Administration followed, employing millions to build bridges, schools, and post offices. It wasn't just construction. It was dignity, pride, and the chance to feed a family again. In the Tennessee Valley, dams rose under the TVA, flooding towns not with water, but with electricity and opportunity. Families who had lived in darkness gathered around radios, not because they could afford one, but because for the first time they had the power to plug one in. Across the country, swing music floated through the air, not as a distraction, but as proof that life was stirring again. FDR knew America couldn't just rebuild. It had to reform. The SEC was created to rein in Wall Street's chaos. The FDIC protected savings so no one's life would disappear in a bank run again. And then came Social Security, promising workers that they wouldn't have to labor until collapse. For the first time, the government guaranteed not just survival, but dignity in old age. Even art became part of recovery. The Federal Arts Project put painters, writers, and photographers back to work, capturing the soul of a nation clawing its way back. Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother didn't show victory. It showed endurance. Hollywood lit up screens with films like The Wizard of Oz, where a gray world turned to color. In the middle of despair, Americans dared to dream again. Slowly, piece by piece, the nation began to rise, not through miracles, but through sweat, laws, and stubborn hope. The Great Depression didn't end with cheers. It ended with calloused hands, new institutions, and a country determined to never fall so hard again. Yet as factories hummed back to life, many weren't making radios or cars anymore. They were making helmets, boots, and ammunition. America was recovering, but another storm, this time global, was already on the horizon. Conclusion: the Great Depression wasn't just an economic collapse. It was a test of survival. A decade that began with champagne and jazz ended with breadlines, dust storms, and quiet endurance. Millions lost jobs, homes, and hope. Yet somehow the nation refused to break. Piece by piece, through Roosevelt's New Deal and the sheer will of ordinary people, America rose again. But recovery didn't feel like a sudden triumph. It was slow, uneven, and born from struggle. The Depression ended not with fireworks, but with blistered hands, new laws, and a collective promise. Never again would the nation allow unchecked greed to destroy so many lives. And yet, just as America was beginning to stand tall, another shadow crept over the horizon. This time it wasn't a financial crash. It was a global conflict that would demand everything the country had rebuilt and more. The Great Depression may have tested America's endurance, but World War too would test its very soul. History isn't just about dates and numbers. It's about people who lived through moments they never thought they could survive. If this story of the Great Depression gave you a new perspective on how fragile and resilient our world can be, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to help more people discover these untold stories, and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of history we bring to life. And tell me in the comments, what surprised you most about the Great Depression, the wild boom before the crash, the despair that followed, or the way America fought to rise again? Your thoughts help shape what we explore next. Because the past isn't finished, it still whispers in the present, and together we'll keep uncovering the stories that changed the world.